Surveying Christianity's African Roots, Session 1, a focus on preparation for the set time in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. Let's look at just what this lecture series will entail, as well as Session 1. There are five main things that we are going to cover in Session 1. First, the challenge to the entire lecture series is piecing together ancient history. Second, we're going to explore the nature of surveying Christianity's African roots. And when I say nature, we are going to address the following. What are these lectures about? Why does the church need to know this? What can be learned from the lectures? And when in human history did these events occur? Next, for Session 1, we are going to provide a detailed overview. And then next, we are going to dive into the divine preparation of Galatians 4:4, which states, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." Then lastly, we are going to look at the stage that was set in Africa for the birth of Christ. Let's begin looking at this challenge in piecing together ancient history. Trying to understand Africa's contributions to Christianity by studying mainstream church history today is like trying to understand the value and contribution of wheat by examining a biscuit. First of all, Mama just made the biscuits this morning, but the wheat in them had grown months ago. And not all the parts of a wheat kernel are included in the flour that made the biscuit. The biscuit flour has been so sifted with other ingredients that it is nearly impossible to examine them separately. So in order to examine the parts of the wheat that made the biscuit flour, we would need to leave Mama's kitchen here in Detroit, then go back into time to the wheat fields of Alabama, Iowa, Kansas, or wherever the wheat grew. I realize that sounds foolish, but that's exactly what we are going to attempt in this presentation about Christianity. In order to understand Africa's contributions to Christianity, we must go to the many other locations and time periods than where mainstream church history resources take us. Africa's history and contributions predates much of mainstream church history. Many parts of the African church are not included in mainstream church history curriculums. Africa's contributions to several core Christian institutions, philosophies, theology is so interwoven into Christianity today that we can never identify its origin as African. So why does this matter? Not for pride, but for the sake of Africa's identity and that of her children of the diaspora. It is imperative that the foundation Africa has laid for the Christian church be given its due visibility. Today, we begin to gain greater visibility into Africa's history and contribution. It's worth the attempt, and today we are beginning Session 1. And we're going to begin by answering the question, what is this 10-session presentation? Well, it's a lecture. It's not a discussion. It's not a question and answer. It's not a debate. It's a lecture. And it's a lecture about a survey. It doesn't give complete history. It doesn't deal with ideology. It's a survey of what can be found in resources that are available. It contains historic content. Some of the content, time just doesn't permit a detailed discussion. Also, some of the history that's interesting, pertinent, and important is yet to be uncovered. Of course, some of the history has been lost to oblivion. But there are other topics about Africa that aren't related to Christian Africa. And sadly, we're not able to include it in this presentation. So, that leads us to the next question. Why is this lecture series even needed in the first place? Well, it contains neglected truths about church history. It fills gaps in mainstream's narrative about church history. It brings visibility into Africa's crucial role in shaping Western Christianity to disillusioned or uninformed church members. What will we learn from this lecture series? We will learn over 500 years of African church history. That's from the 1st century through the 6th century AD. We'll see where Christians lived in Africa. We will understand how Africans shaped the Christian mindset. And we will realize that the African church contributions to Christianity predated Constantinian, Roman Catholic, and Dark Age Christianity. So let's gain some perspective about this historic content. Too often, researching Christianity in Africa is prematurely abandoned. What also gets abandoned is a treasury of history about how, from the 1st through the 6th century AD, Africans shaped the foundation for Western Christianity. And let's put that in perspective in terms of a timeline. We're going to survey 500 years of major African church history that occurred centuries before the birth of Muhammad, the prophet and founder of Islam. 235 years before the first monastery in Europe. 500 years before Roman Catholics became a separate faith. 550 years before the first Roman Catholic crusade. 900 years before Gutenberg invented the printing press for Rome. 900 years before Europeans kidnapped African citizens for personal property. 950 years before Europeans sent Christian missionaries into Africa. 1150 years before King James's Bible compilation. 1350 years before Europe divided and exploited Africa's natural resources. 1350 years before Europe established Christian colonies in Africa. That's some perspective about when these events occurred. So what will we learn today in this first session? Well, we're going to learn about key preparation around the Mediterranean Sea that needed to be in place prior to the birth of Jesus in order for the gospel to spread in Africa. We are going to learn about the linguistic, infrastructural, and social preparations that occurred in Africa. And we will see how the Hebrew language found its way into North Africa. We'll learn about Hebrew communities and how they arrived in North Africa. And we will learn about the divine preparation that facilitated the missionary efforts of the African Messianic Hebrews from the upper room, described in Acts chapter 2, verse 10. And we will learn about the indigenous Berbers of Africa. So let's begin to dive into this divine preparation for Jesus' earthly ministry. So the content that will be presented will cover events from the 9th century BC to the early 1st century AD. So let's talk about the Berber people. The Berber people became North Africans with unwavering faith even at the cost of suffering and death. Shining through the research was the sound and unwavering faith of these indigenous North African people. The term Berber is an onomatopoeia label assigned to a collection of African tribes whose language sounded radically different to the Roman and Greek ear. Now, as I dove into Christianity's African roots, I frequently stumbled across contributions of Berber people. Then I remember seeing that name, Berber, in all of my DNA profiles. It was from my maternal DNA. More specifically, my mother's DNA matched the DNA profile of Berbers from the Mauritania region, which is now Morocco. They made profound contributions to Christianity as martyrs, leaders, scholars, and in education. The individual Berber tribes have been identified as, and you'll see them appear here. I'm not going to try to pronounce them. Hopefully, if you want additional information about the sources, you can find them in the book on Amazon. Their contribution and martyrdom in church history is worthy of great honor. And they were also the ancestors of the Moors. The question becomes, how did the Berber people get to understand the language that these Messianic Hebrews spoke? Here's a map of the homeland of the Berber people. You see up there at the top where it says Berber there. And these areas, these colored areas, the brown, the red, the orange, and the purple, they are areas where the Hamido-Semitic languages were spoken around 500 BC. Today, if you wanted to find out more about the Hamido-Semitic languages, it goes by the label of Afro-Asiatic languages. They were Berber, Egyptian, Semitic, and Cushitic. It's believed that they were derived from a single language that had been spoken thousands of years prior. When those who spoke the single language had dispersed geographically, the language eventually morphed into separate and distinct languages or dialects. But what's interesting is that long before 500 BC, Berber culture had already socialized somewhat with the Canaanite culture. Notice the location of the Old Testament Canaanite city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos near the upper right on the map in the Semitic region. Also, you can notice the Old Testament Jerusalem. Now, as a result of these linguistic commonalities, communication was a lot easier, at least for a period of time, in terms of language structure. These Canaanites that had socialized with the Berber culture was instrumental in the Berber population coming to Christ centuries later. So let's talk about this Canaanite culture, and let's see just how is it that they move from that far right side of the map all the way to the far left side of the map. Well, from 2500 BC to about 539 BC, the Canaanites were a dominant civilization, as well documented in the Old Testament. And part of their dominance was one of the reasons why God's judgment was so harsh on them. Also, their ships dominated the Mediterranean Sea from 1200 BC to about 800 BC. They were skillful builders and craftsmen, and they were master traders with vast coastal routes along the Mediterranean Sea. About 500 years later, after their dominance, that The Greeks referred to them as Phoenicians. So when you read or hear about Phoenicians, they're talking about the old Canaanite civilization. The Old Testament kings, when you read in Scripture, the kings and the prophets recognize the expertise of the Canaanite civilization. And here are some scriptures that cite this recognition of expertise. King Solomon even used them to build for him. I mentioned city-state, so let me describe what a city-state is. A city-state is a city, along with its surrounding territories, that is self-sustainable enough to be an independent sovereign territory. So the Canaanite city-states, again, are Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. They're mentioned in the Old Testament and New Testament. And with the exception of Byblos, the New Testament mentions these city-states a dozen of times. Jesus even mentions them. So let's look at the travel routes of these Canaanite ships, as well as the areas where they had ports, where they socialize and mingle with different cultures on this map. There are 4 items on this map I want you to focus on. First, their language, again, belongs to the Hamitic family of languages from which Hebrew emerged. The next item I want to draw your attention to is the Canaanite city-states. And you see them to the right. These heavy black areas on the map represent locations within the Mediterranean where the Canaanite language was used during trade negotiations. And you can see Carthage there in the white, with a little arrow pointing to its location. And the thin hash lines on the map denote Canaanite trade routes along the Mediterranean coast. Now this map shows ancient African coastal territories in the Mediterranean Sea. So you see Africa is at the very bottom with A, B, C, D, E, F written right at their coast along the Mediterranean. This map shows the locations of 90% of the ancient African territories covered during this survey of Christianity's African roots in the early church. Let's look at these locations. A, Mauritania. B, Numidia. C, Carthage. D, Leptis Magna. E, Cyrene. F, Alexandria. Let's note the location of Rome. There's Rome. There's Jerusalem. And notice the distance between Jerusalem and Alexandria, Egypt. The territory is about the same distance as it is from Detroit to Alabama. And then, as I mentioned, you have Africa itself as a continent. Let's go to the 9th century BC. I had mentioned that the Canaanites had mingled with the Berber culture. It all began in the 9th century and ultimately led to the Canaanites / Phoenicians establishing Carthage in Africa. Today's Tunisian community credits its origin to the Canaanite colony of Carthage, established in 814 BC by a Phoenician woman that the Berbers called Dido. The Tunisian Hebrew community claimed to be the oldest Hebrew community in Africa. Establishing Carthage occurred during the same time period as the events of Israel's evil king Jehoahaz in 2 Kings chapter 13, 1 through 9. So now let's go to the 6th century BC. Let's look at the Hebrew community of Mauritania in Africa. Today's Moroccan Hebrew community credits its origin to the Hebrews migrating there after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem around 587 BC. The destruction of that first temple is described in 2 Kings 25, 8 through 9. They claim that their ancestors had settled amongst the Berbers. And perhaps also later, when King Cyrus of Persia released the Hebrews from 70 years of Babylonian captivity in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Note that according to Esther 1:1, the Persian Medes Empire also included parts of Africa, Egypt, and Cush. You see the map on the next slide. Now don't confuse ancient Mauritania with the current African nation of Mauritania. Different spelling of the name and different location. So notice here on the map, in the gray area, we have the Persian Medes Empire, and you can see on it to the left, in the middle, circled in red, territories of Egypt and that of Cush was included in the empire. And the point being that it wasn't a stretch for a migration of Hebrews from there across North Africa. Until the 3rd century BC, the Hebrew community of Libya in Africa. Libyan Hebrew communities in Cyrene and Leptis Magna regions extended back to the 3rd century BC at the least. Impacts to their community had been prophesied 3 centuries earlier by Daniel's revelations regarding Alexander the Great in Daniel chapter 8, chapter 10, and in chapter 11. Now moving to the 2nd century BC, we're going to talk about a Libyan who preserved Hebrew history. Hebrew history between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, which some people refer to as the silent years, was preserved by Jason of Cyrene in Libya, Africa, sometime after 167 BC. In 2 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 23, it pays tribute to the significant value of Jason's library. It states, all this detailed by Jason of Cyrene in 5 volumes, we will try to condense into a single book. So the Judaism structure and the Judaic practices in the Gospels during Jesus' earthly ministries have been constructed solely from Jason's historical library. And also in the 2nd century BC, the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. In about 132 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek by 70 Hebrew scholars. This Greek translation is also called the Septuagint, or LXX. That's the Roman numeral for 70. Greek had become a familiar language throughout and was used by most writers. Now, we are into the 1st century BC. 2 pivotal events occurred: the king of Numidia and the growth of Rome. In 40 BC, the African Numidian Berber king Abrio died. His vast kingdom then became a part of the Roman province. And it was through the labor of the Berber people of that kingdom that the Roman Empire experienced a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity. The Romans' Latin tongue became part of the multilingual Numidia and Carthage culture. The Roman Empire had paved roads for its chariots. This also made for convenient travel by foot, beast, a caravan by others, and later facilitated Joseph, Mary's, and the boy Jesus' escape from King Herod. So by now, the set time of Galatians 4 had fully come. So let's review this divine preparation. In place by the end of the 1st century BC throughout the Mediterranean were seafaring transportation and port infrastructures for travel. 1,300 years of Canaanite, Berber, Hebrew, Phoenician, Punic, dialects. The Greek language had flourished for the past 325 years. Port cities where merchants from diverse cultures aggregated for commerce. Multi-linguistic populations across North Africa that understood variants of the Hebrew and Greek tongue. Knowledge and copies of the Hebrew and Greek Old Testament manuscripts. Multitudes of Hebrews in North Africa who anticipated their Messiah and who understood various Gentile worldviews. And this is unlike the Hebrews in Judea, who very much kept to themselves and didn't have to or didn't bother to understand mindset. We have the Roman Empire's infrastructural stability and prosperity. We have paved Roman roads upon which to travel. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. At this point, when it says the set time had fully come, that suggests that there was a completion of some unspecified yet necessary preparation. Completion was the precondition for the birth of Jesus. Necessary was the body of work that had to be in place before Jesus' birth. That body of work also facilitated the spread of the good news and the way by African Messianic Hebrew missionaries throughout their homeland. The groundwork just presented had set into motion 500 years of African church history. In the 9 sessions that follow, you will discover Africa's contributions that ultimately shaped the foundation of Western Christian philosophy, theology, and institutions. So prepare yourself. For the next 9 sessions, we will explore the people, the locations, the faith, and the contributions of African Christians beginning in the 1st century A.D. through the 6th century A.D. See the host of these lectures about acquiring the book, Surveying Christianity's African Roots. Or you can order it online. If you're interested in a spiral-bound version of the book, go to the lulu.com site. But if you just want a regular bound book, you can find it on amazon.com. Thank you.